I am here today with the Professor Marilyn Fleer, that is an exceptional occasion for talking with one of the best recognized professionals in the field of early child education and in general in education. Professor Marilyn Fleer is full professor from the University of Monash and has published more than 150 working in psychology, education, and social science in general. Really it's an honor for us to receive Marilyn in our university, and I will have a very short conversation with her in order to get her impression about the field of early child education and other theoretical matters that are very close related to this field. Thank you very much, Marilyn, for being with me here. And please, first of all, despite of the fact that I make a short presentation, very short, I would like that you talk me a little about your academic trajectory and the recognitions that I know you have. I want to say also that Marilyn is the current president of the International Society for Cultural, Historical, and Activity Research. Please, Professor Fleer, you have the word.
Thank you, Professor Fernando. It's so wonderful to be here, and thank you for the wonderful invitation to come to Brasilia. It's an absolute pleasure to be here, and I've had a very enjoyable time here. Thank you so much. The situation here is so very different to Australia. So my background, of course, is in the field of early childhood education and with a special focus on development. At Monash University, I've had the honour of working with a group of academics, colleagues. There I lead with my co-leader, Associate Professor Nikolai Veretsov. We lead a research group on child and community development, and I also have a wonderful group of PhD students who are really trying to solve some important problems that we have in the field of early childhood education. So collectively, we work together to try and use the concepts of Vygotsky, particularly to solve the problems that we face. But you probably don't know much about Australia and the Australian situation, so perhaps I could share a little bit about that first.
Yes, of course. I had the great opportunity to be visiting professor in your group, and really I very impressed by the level of internationalization that your program have. It is really one fact to remark the quantity of international students you have in the program. It is really impressed me too much. And also impressed me the great attention that receiving Australia education. And I will listen a little about how you appreciate this and which are the resources that you have at this moment as leading professor in this area in relation to your research program.
You're absolutely right. We're very privileged because we have PhD students from all over the world. We have students from China. We have students from Bangladesh. We have had students from India, Brunei. We have colleagues from Mauritius. We have colleagues from Vietnam. We have from many countries, and of course we also have in the field many colleagues who work with us who are also culturally diverse. But that's really the situation in Australia, because we have been a country that has continued to develop in a culturally diverse way for a very long time now. So that's the norm. But with that comes some really interesting things, because people who work with us as part of our team bring to the problems of early childhood education very different backgrounds from the international community, so that they're able to look at problems in a diverse range of ways, and through that to think more creatively about the kinds of issues that we're trying to solve. But I think what supports us really well is that is a series of Australian Research Council grants, discovery grants that we've had, which is, it's an Australian Council for Research in Australia has it's a very prestigious organisation that will only give funding out to a very small number of people each year, and it's highly competitive. So it's peer reviewed by many people and goes through a whole process of a board looking at it and so on. So the work that's funded is supported, if you like, by the academic community. So it's very prestigious, and that has allowed our group to actually to really explore some important ideas and have the resources to really do some very important methodological work. So, for instance, with the problems that we face in Australia, but I think there's this is a very strong international concern as well. One of the foundational problems that we've had in early childhood education has been historically and in different countries expressed somewhat differently, but the research evidence, longitudinal research evidence, has supported the idea that investing early in young children and developing and creating conditions for children's development at a very young age has a huge impact in terms of children's not only success at school, but their later life chances. So as a result of this longitudinal work that's been done in a number of countries now, and economic discussions around how investing early saves resources later for an economy, many countries have begun to invest in early childhood education, but also begin to support the development of this field in a research, the research capacity of the field. And historically, very little research funding has been put into this area internationally.
Yes.
And in Australia
right.
in particular. So, for example, if I think 20 years ago when I started my career, there was one professor in the whole of Australia who worked in this area.
Yes.
And now we probably have about 20 who specifically focus on early childhood education. So it's not a huge development, but it is a recognition that there are, and this is full professors I'm talking about, who are research leaders in the different universities. So and also as part of that, these colleagues, including myself, have been very active in trying to solve some of the long-standing problems. So what we're facing, I think, is a situation where, say for instance, the OECD has recognised early childhood internationally and many countries that are still developing economically have also recognised it and are investing in this area. But there is this real big challenge.
Yes,
and the challenge is that governments are saying, we're putting money into this area, where are the outcomes? We want to see outcomes quickly, we want our communities to develop very quickly, and through this there has been somewhat of a tension where there has this what's become known as schoolification of the early years. So a kind of more formalisation, a more focus on cognition, and areas that have traditionally supported the development of children, such as play, have in some countries now there's been very strong pressure to reduce the time that children engage in these imaginative and emotionally charged conditions that create development for young children.
Marilyn, this is one point that impressed me so much, that you are centered on the research in early childhood education, but together with this, you have working intensively in theoretical and methodological matters that make of you one of the reference of the world at this moment in this area. I would like to know how the cultural historical framework have helped you in this work, and which are the main challenges that you are in front your team at this moment.
Absolutely. Cultural historical theory, and particularly the collected works of Vygotsky, have been foundational for our group. And they've been foundational for our group because the concepts in Vygotsky's work that have helped us to begin to explore this dynamic relations between play and learning in the first instance is something that we have received funding for to explore, and our group in different ways has been and continues to look at this challenge. And what we've drawn upon particularly in the first iteration of our thinking, because have to remember in Australia, being so far away from Russia and the collected works of Vygotsky, and in the early days we had very little access to the primary sources, because we know they were only published in English.
Yes, and even in Russian.
Exactly.
Was published very late.
So, and in those days when we started our research, email wasn't even invented. Nobody knew about Google.
Yes.
So you had no capacity, being so far away, to explore and use the concepts of Vygotsky's in a direct way. Of course, there were secondary sources available, but as we know, the secondary sources are certainly not as rich, and they have different kinds of interpretations of Vygotsky's work depending on the need of the person writing the material. So for us, our group has worked really hard to look at the volumes of Vygotsky's collected works, and in the early days our problem about the schoolification was also there was a sort of a double bind, because we had this government international push for more formalised schooling in the early years, but on the other hand we had this tradition in Australia, and in many countries it's the same, this tradition of thinking about children's development from a maturational rather than a cultural perspective.
Yes.
And this is kind of like a universal. It's the fallout from Piaget, and so many professionals in early childhood education in Australia and also many other countries have de-emphasised the role of the educator in the developmental process. And so with this history of thinking that there is only one view of development and it goes through ages and stages, and at the same time the role of the educator is to almost put their hands behind their back and not actually actively be constructing with children and having an active role in children's learning. So this is the other part of the context. So we have this interesting tension. So in this interesting tension, what was first of all foundational was to recognise in the field of early childhood education that there was a problem, that there was a problem, a theoretical problem that needed to be solved, and this relation between play and learning, not as a binary of work and play, but actually something that was dynamically related. So Vygotsky's work on play was foundational for us, and of course our groups have looked very closely at how play is the creation of an imaginary situation, that in the imaginary situation the child changes the meaning of the objects and uses the objects as a pivot to give it new meaning, where the child introduces and takes on new actions as a result of the imaginary situation. But in our work, what we also found was that wasn't enough. We need, of course, a system of concept, which of course is what Vygotsky's work is all about. So we began in this place to take the lead in Australia and in some quarters internationally, to move away from traditional views of how children play and develop, and use Vygotsky's work to actually reimagine the whole conception of play, because traditionally play has been with this Piagetian notion of a stage-based approach to how children play, this notion that the teacher or the educator or the pedagogue, depending on which country you're in, really has a de-emphasised role. So our work, what we started to see in our work was that actually it's not just the child that creates the imaginary situations. The adult has a huge role to play in actually creating imaginary situations with children, and that this is actually a cultural development in some communities and in some families, and not necessarily in other families. So again, supporting this idea that that play is a cultural practice, it's culturally developed in families and communities, and it's privileged as a cultural expression in some communities in very different ways. And there isn't a standard, which of course the traditional literature has suggested. So Vygotsky's work was really powerful for that, particularly then as part of that, the concepts of everyday concepts and scientific thinking, or spontaneous and academic concepts, however we want to name this. But this notion of, in the learning and play context, that children become more consciously aware of their actions, of course led us to thinking about not just Vygotsky's work, but Elkonen's work and many others, where the play of children begins to move closer to the idea of children's reality. So when they're role-playing, they are actually taking on the cultural practices that they see in their communities, following Elkonen's work here, of course. And that is leading to the idea of more consciously understanding their cultural practices. So rather than living the experiences of their cultures, they're starting to think more consciously about it. And of course, Vygotsky talked about that beautifully when he used that lovely example of the two sisters pretending to be sisters. So in reality, they were sisters, they were pretending to be sisters,
yes,
and through this,
course,
actually consciously coming to understand the concept of sisterhood.
Yes.
This was a really powerful catalyst for our group to actually say, well, cognition, in whatever form is constructed in schooling, is a cultural practice.
Of course.
And it's been invented by humans.
But one point on which I would like to listen to you is that you emphasize, and it is real, the role of consciousness and control of the child during the play. But you are writing even about the imagination, also emphasizes the role of emotions and the generative character that is displayed in the children. That because imagination is also inventing realities and not only the assimilation of realities. And there are some concepts in the first moment and last one of Vygotsky's work in which there are concepts that practically was not taken into account for the advances of in cultural historical psychology. And I guess that you have a novelty taking those concepts of Vygotsky, particular imagination, and extent of the inventing creative character that the child has in the play. And it is very strong point in the current
Absolutely,
picture.
and it fits again with the evolution of our group, because our own cultural development of our own group, of course we began with Vygotsky's conception of play and others who've developed it further, contemporary scholars, and of course Vygotsky's concept of everyday and scientific thinking. But that wasn't enough. That wasn't enough. So the next part of our journey was to do exactly as you said. We started to explore Vygotsky's concept of imagination and creativity, because the imagination, of course, is that relation between making it concrete and in the creation process. But in order to do that, you need to bring different processes together, to abstract them, to think about them, and then turn them into reality, and vice versa. So when something is created, it in turn gives the possibilities for imagining new directions. So his work was very important there. But why it was particularly important was that, and I'll go on to emotions in a moment, because none of these things are separate. I'm really just unpacking them in terms of how we might have been foregrounding one dimension above another at that particular point in our own theoretical work. And of course, each time we had these new challenges, we applied for more funding to the Australian Research Council. So that first area we had funding for, and then we recognised we needed more. So not just more thinking and more research, but funding to support this process in our group, because our PhD students are very centrally part of the work of this research project. But with the imagination and creativity and the emotions, one of the things that we started to notice in our own research, in terms of the work that we did, in terms of gathering video observations, was that that children, and this is where we're very, very fond of the work of Zafarozets and Elkonenova, and many others who've actually explored this idea of fairy tales and creating specific dramatical conditions that actually allow us to see these very highly energized, emotionally energized moments where children are role-playing, where children are bringing not just what they've learned from society into their play, but what they can develop together in the imaginary situations they create, but also where we take fairy tales and any other storylines that are in their essence contained emotionally charged experiences that children, there is a plot, there is emotion following the character of the different emotional experiences of the different characters. So there might be the feeling of great joy to be playing, but at the same time a great fear because the bear in the fairy tale is creating certain conditions. And this has been really important for us to look at how children move in and out of these imaginary situations, how they flicker between the imaginary world and reality, and how they extract themselves emotionally sometimes because it's too much. They're experiencing a very high level of intensity, and how other times they actively want to engage in these emotionally charged situations. And so that's sort of the work we're doing now, and it is our fourth major Australian Research Council Discovery Grant project to take it to this next step. We haven't resolved everything yet. We're still looking at our video observations and really working in a very dynamic way. And of course, methodologically, this is very challenging for us.
Because for everyone, because this is a point in which really there has not been advances in cultural historical tradition.
And this is what makes it very difficult for us, because there are no ideal forms of how to do this. Not. So our group is collectively exploring this, and methodologically, what's important for our work, what we do, the challenges we face is that because traditionally researchers have been interested in early childhood in terms of cognition, but we want to hold in our research the wholeness of the situation, which of course is the emotions, it's the flickering in and out of the real world and the imaginary situation, it's the consciousness of not just how the child's emotions, raw emotions are being experienced, but consciously thinking about these characters in the play and how they are experiencing that, but also how they are consciously thinking about the concepts which they then use to support their own development. So all of these dynamic processes, so everyday and scientific concepts that the teacher might be engineering, socially engineering in these situations, we want to keep them all intact. And video observations really allow us the possibility to video record not just the everyday practices that we see teachers create in early childhood settings, or that families create in their home environment, or we create in the community, because we video record all of those things. But what we are interested in is the relations between all of these things, so that we have a broader picture of a child's development.
But something very interesting in this is that you facilitate that the child's enter in contact in very spontaneous ways, and they force you to conceptualize situation and processes that you don't have anything a priori. And it is very important because, for example, in one of the videos I looked at when I was there, one child is very innovative in the answer that he gave to the person, but suddenly it changed completely the communicative situation, and then the emotional context changed completely, and it influenced so much in the way that the intellectual dialogue with the child took in that moment. What do you think about this very active and processal way to conceptualize all the information that you recorded in the experimental situation, not experimental, in the daily life situation that allow a very rich communicative scenarios?
We have, the conceptualization is kind of at maybe 3 levels. When we create these conditions, when we video record the everyday life, we look for we look for emotionally charged situations or transitions. Transitions, we know from Marianne Heidegger's work, transitions is really important. We know from Vygotsky's work that the dramatic events are really important. And we know that from a pedagogical perspective, families and teachers also want to know what conditions do they have to create. So all of these things are in our mind when we methodologically create the conditions for the video recording. So what's important is, first of all, as you rightly mentioned, is to video record the spontaneous, the everyday situations, because you cannot understand the transition. In fact, you cannot predict the transition. You may have an idea that that a certain period of time will be more emotionally charged, or will create a more conscious awareness of concepts, or a more conscious awareness of an emotional state, or whatever it is that the research question is seeking to achieve. So we know that we can predict, but we can never be sure. So it's very important. We never turn the camera off. When we visit a family home, we come with the camera already turned on. We open the door, because the opening of the door can be a dramatic event.
Of course.
It can be something that's actually really significant, but we don't always know. But when we've collected a lot of material and we observe and we analyse the video documentation that we've collected, we go over it and over it and over it iteratively, and there are things that we see later that we become curious about, and then we wonder, why did this moment occur? What was it that created these conditions? And then we go back through our video material and we can start to see the kind of interactions, the kind, like you were saying, when a child responds in a particular way, we begin to notice that. So that's one part that's important. But we also work with the teachers, because we don't want to just have teachers thinking that they can, and they would argue the same, that they can just do anything. So we want some sort of consciousness on their part to create certain conditions as well. So we work with teachers to discuss, to brainstorm, to explore possibilities. We discuss Vygotsky's work. We talk about certain concepts, and we talk about this notion of imagination and in play and creativity. We discuss emotions. In fact, in one of our research sites where we deliberately looked at emotions and thinking, I had the collected works of Vygotsky. We looked at one of the volumes, and I read little excerpts, and we discussed it. And so, in order to help the teachers think about these concepts and how they can use the concepts, and therefore create in a more focused way some sort of dramatic situation that allows these things to happen. So an example I can give is a teacher who, in the storytelling of the three little bears, the children discuss wanting to make the bears sad, and of course the bears that they've got are just toys. So how do you create the emotions? And so the children, they then talk about how they feel and how they show certain emotions and how they might be able to make the bears do this. And then we have the children say, well, when I am at home and my mother tells me off, I feel like this, and this is what I do, and I run and I do this, and then another child would respond. So this creates this very dynamic situation for which we video record. Yeah, and then of course we use Vygotsky's work to analyse this and use the concepts. But we take it further, because we really, we think that all of these things, it's a system of concepts, it's a dynamic. It's not a silo. We cannot understand children's development and how to support and create the conditions for children's development without deliberately using these concepts for analysis and for thinking about how we frame these things. So Vygotsky's work's been very important for our group.
Yes, of course.
And this has been a major challenge for us, is the use of these concepts in video observations, because, as you said, traditionally that's not been the case, and for video observations, so we use iMovie, and we have video clips that we create and we develop into into scenarios, and then we explore those further. And some of our team, they take these video clips back to teachers and children, and they discuss it as well with children. So it gives new possibilities, which we're only just exploring methodologically further now. But central to all of this, of course, is Vygotsky's idea that we're studying the process of development. We're not studying the end product. It's very central for what we're doing.
Function, yes.
Absolutely.
Of course.
And I think this work is contributing back into this notion of schoolification. So we're pushing against what we see happening not just in Australia but in many countries internationally, where people want to have greater outcomes in education. So they think by making education more formal, taking away play, by focusing only on cognition, forgetting about how the learning is emotionally...
Because really, your research are beyond the cognition.
Yes,
the
absolutely.
Is much more than cognition.
Absolutely.
It's something interesting. Unfortunately, Professor Marilyn, we don't have
more time,
and I would like to ask you some final words, maybe in relation to the challenge you are in front of you, and a little about the next Congress of ISCA organization from which you are the president, and what do you expect there in Sydney? I know that it is very serious to ask for a short time answer to this question.
Okay,
but
I'll try.
Good to close your
Yes.
conversation with me in relation to these questions.
Well, I think the Congress is going to be very exciting because Fernando, of course, is going to be one of the keynote speakers, and I think that this area of emotions, in relation to social subjectivity and sense, personal sense, all of the things, the work that you've been doing, I think that these, and you've talked about this at another Congress when it was in the Netherlands as well. I think this is a really important area, and certainly in our group's work, as we've come to deal with this schoolification problem, and we've used most of Vygotsky's work, we've come to see that this area of emotions and the way that you've thought about social subjectivity of these, what we've called the holistic situation of children's development, but you've theorised it in a very deliberate way. I think this is one of the interesting areas that hopefully will be discussed quite explicitly at the Congress through your presentation. Yes. And I think it's an area that still is in the process of development, I think, as a community. So I think that's one of the challenges. I think that will be discussed. I think there will also be very rich methodological discussions that will be occurring, and I think that that's very important for the development of the field. And I think a third area that is likely to emerge is this this notion of how concepts from Vygotsky, the primary source of Vygotsky, as opposed to the use of secondary sources where particular people have taken it in a particular way depending on their societal needs and the problems that they face, but to go back to the original works and to develop them further, I think should appear in the Congress as something very foundational and important. And my own personal view is that I'd like to see that privileged in the discussions and see where that takes us to the future, because I think there are so many concepts in Vygotsky's work that are so rich and are still underdeveloped, have not been used as extensively as a system of concepts to support the problems that we face now, but to draw on the original works I think is an important dimension. So I'm hoping, but who knows, it will be a lovely place to have it in Sydney. It'll have an Australian flavour to the Congress, but what's really important is as we know that the concepts of Vygotsky were always discussed and elaborated and debated. It's the social context in which these concepts are given life that the Congress will support, and I think that's much more exciting than reading a paper. It's the discussions that take us further, and the Congress should do that.
Professor Marilyn, thank you very much for in this short time to make great pictures about your lines, challenge, and current question that you are treated at this moment in your team. It has been really very nice for us, and it is important that in general Brazilian academic population enter in contact with you because Australia is at this moment a leader in the research, one leader in the research of childhood early education. Then, thank you very much, and we expect to have you here in another moment for continuing this
discussion.
Nice
Thank you so much, Fernando. It was lovely to have this conversation with you.